I try to imagine a fellow smarter than myself, and then I try to think, what would he do?
Charge up your axons, ready your receptors, and shift your lobes into upper beta phase. You are listening to Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast dedicated to helping you optimize your brain with the latest breakthroughs in neuroscience, nootropics, and psychopharmacology.
Hello and welcome to Smart Drug Smarts. My name is Jesse Lawler. I am your host, and this is the 160th episode of this podcast dedicated to the ongoing betterment of your brain by any and all means at your disposal. This is the almost Christmas edition. 2 days before Christmas is when we'll actually be publishing this, and we're thick in the midst of holiday season 2016, when, among other things, a lot of eating is going on. And this seemed as good a time as any to publish an episode that we've had on the books for a while, in the can, I guess. A conversation I had a few months ago with Dr. Nicole Avena about food addiction. We had an episode not so long ago with author Maya Salovitz about addiction in general, thinking more about traditionally addictive compounds, things like cocaine, heroin, etc. But possibly ding-dongs and Cheez-Its also deserve a place at that table, at least insofar as your brain is concerned. And we're going to be talking with Dr. Nicole Avena about that in the main interview. It's a little bit of a longer interview today. I was about to say a meaty interview, which technically it is, but it's probably more a carby interview than a meaty interview when you get right down to it. If you hang around until the very end of the episode, also kind of keeping on the addictive theme, some really interesting findings about placebo effects and how expectation can impact our craving on the types of things we're craving, whether that's ding-dongs, methamphetamine, a loved one that you haven't seen in a long time, any of those things. Hang around for that in the Ruthless Listener Retention gimmick. But as usual, let's kick things off first with This Week in Neuroscience.
Smart Drug Smarts, This Week in Neuroscience.
Humans have kind of a famously crummy sense of smell compared to most other things in the animal kingdom. Smell is not really our forte, but we've still got nostrils and a nose and an olfactory cortex within our brain that deals with incoming smell signals. But you start getting into the weird and the esoteric when you start hearing about the differences between breathing through your mouth and breathing through your nose. Does this really make a difference? Should we care? Supposedly you sleep better if you breathe through your nose. And of course, this time of year with cold season and people having trouble breathing through their nose at all, this becomes frustrating advice sometimes. If you've got to breathe through your mouth if you want to breathe versus suffocate, sometimes we're just not able to do it the right way. Can be frustrating, but does it really matter? And according to a recent study published in the Journal of Neuroscience, the answer might be, at least in some cases, a definitive yes. Scientists at the Northwestern University Feinberg School of Medicine were looking at a link between the patterns of breathing and brain activity in 7 epilepsy patients, and they started to see signs that the brains were behaving differently based on whether a patient was inhaling or exhaling during the onset of an epileptic episode, and also whether that breathing was taking place through the nose or through the mouth, said the study's lead author, Christina Zelano. One of our major findings is that there is a dramatic difference in brain activity in the amygdala and hippocampus during inhalation compared with exhalation. When you breathe in, we discovered you're stimulating neurons in the olfactory cortex, the amygdala, and the hippocampus, all across the limbic system. They went on to do a variety of studies dealing with learning, memory, fear responses, and how each of these can be modulated by the type of breathing that a person's doing, and broadening these experiments to deal with non-epileptic populations. And among other really interesting and kind of surprising findings is that you're apparently more likely to remember an object if you encounter it while you're inhaling than while you're exhaling. But as if that wasn't weird enough, this effect disappears if you're breathing through your mouth rather than through your nose. So in other words, the optimum breathing situation for cognition, at least according to these studies, is to be inhaling through your nose whenever possible. Needless to say, we do not live in a perfect world. You will need to exhale occasionally. So let your conscience be your guide, says Solano. If you are in a panicked state, your breathing rhythm becomes faster. As a result, you'll spend proportionately more time inhaling than if you're in a calm state. Thus, our body's innate response to fear with faster breathing could have a positive impact on brain function and result in faster response times to dangerous stimuli in the environment. Now, what she's talking about here is a related finding that people were flashed faces at really quick intervals, like microsecond face flashes of faces displaying lots of different emotions. And if the viewer was in the process of inhaling when they saw the face, they were quicker to recognize a fearful face. So you could sense fear in somebody else more quickly if you're inhaling as you see them. This also lined up with the findings about remembering things better. This probably harkens back to an earlier evolutionary time when our little scurrying ancestors were exploring the world more through their noses than we do nowadays. And some of the most important incoming signals might have been things wafting on the breeze rather than things coming in through your eyes. It's tempting to think that this is sort of an evolutionary throwback because it's hard to imagine why, as fully evolved humans, it would make sense for our brains to behave differently on the inhale versus the exhale phase. But wherever this comes from, it's apparently a little tiny cognitive hack worth being aware of. The study's authors also point out that certain meditative practices that really involve focusing on the breath or control of the breath, some of the psychological and neurological benefits that come along with those practices may be resulting from, as Zolano says, when you inhale, in a sense, you're synchronizing your brain's oscillations across the entire limbic network.
Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast so smart, we have smart in our title twice.
Picked up some 5-star reviews over on iTunes. Listener Spencer4242 says, I love this podcast, really informative and thought-provoking, and I'm making my way through all the episodes. I've definitely become a long-term fan. And Ella H., also from the USA, says, I've been listening to Smart Drug Smarts for a couple of years now, and I immediately realized it wasn't one of those brain candy light podcasts where you let your brain coast, nor was it one to listen to on 1.5 times speed. Well, thank you both very much. Thank you to everybody that has been spreading the word on Smart Drug Smarts, passing us around on the internet, notes slipped into your kid's lunchbox, or things whispered to passing strangers in the subway, whatever it might be. Really appreciate your help in seeding us out there. I wanted to give looking ahead at 2017 just a little bit. Not so much a sneak preview, but kind of a peek behind the curtain or peek into the treasure trove of coming interviews that we've got. We were lucky enough, and again, major hat tip to Michelle on the Smart Drug Smarts team for having wrangled up a bunch of great interviews this past year, more so than we could actually publish in 2016. So we've got some awesome stuff on ice that will be coming at you during the first quarter of 2017. So just a sprinkling now to get you in the mood. We're going to have upcoming episodes on animal brains idebenone passion flower, omega-6 fatty acids, modafinil and armodafinil, the science behind marijuana and creativity, a drug known as kratom, I think I'm pronouncing that right, the gut-brain axis, LED light therapy, and that's just the start. So 2017 is going to be a knock'em sock'em year, but a lot of stuff headed your way. Hope that you were looking forward to it. I certainly am. An open invitation. If you've got ideas for episodes that we ought to have that we haven't had yet that you would like to hear, definitely visit the Contact Us page on the website or drop me an email. That's jesse@smartdrugsmarts.com. Jesse spelled the boy away, Jesse. No I's, no Y's, and certainly no hearts dotting my I's, which I sometimes get from the well-intentioned but misspelling girl at Starbucks. Another great way to find out what we're going to be doing next, and also some retrospectives ideas on what we've done recently, and also even more intel about what's going on in the world of neuroscience. If you've been listening for a while, you know what's coming. All of this and more can be found in the newsletter that we send out weekly-ish called The Brain Breakfast. You can get signed up for that if you haven't already at smartdrugsmarts.com/newsletter. And also a big customary, rousing, and highly appreciated thank you to both the team over at Axon Labs who help get the Axon Labs products out to everybody. I know this is a particularly busy season for them with the holidays upon us. And also, of course, to everybody that has tried the Axon Labs products, Nexus and Mitogen. Both of those are over at axonlabs.io. If you've heard me yammering about those and you haven't tried them out yet, there's no time like the present. Or if you've tried them already, but your bottle is starting to run low and starting to sound like a jingle bell with just a couple of pills rattling around on the inside of it, probably a good time to head back over there. We do have subscription options also for people that want to have an ongoing monthly delivery, get Nexus, Mitogen showing up at their door without having to think about it. You can sign up for that online also. All of this and more over at axonlabs.io. I think that's all the news around the campfire, so let's move on to the main interview.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So I'm about to be speaking with Dr. Nicole Avena. She is the author of the ongoing blog Food Junkie on Psychology Today, the author of the book Why Diets Fail and What to Eat When You're Pregnant, and she's also edited books like Animal Models of Eating Disorders and Hedonic Eating. And as you can gather from all these titles, her career is based on looking at the neurobiology of our relationship to food, how that can get out of whack, and what we can do to effectively and realistically rein our diets in when we realize that the food that's going into us isn't giving us the best long-term outcomes. This is following pretty close on the heels of another addiction-related episode that we just had. Episode number 154 with Maya Salovitz was talking about addiction as a topic as well. One thing that we got pretty technical on in that episode was the difference between addiction, which always has a behavior component, and mere physiological dependence. I say mere in quotation marks, but the example that I liked so much in that episode was crack babies technically have a substance dependence. It's something that they've been used to getting in their bloodstream, but they're not addicted to crack because they don't have any behaviors associated with it. They've been receiving it passively and they wouldn't even know what to do to acquire crack given that they're just babies. I mention this because in the coming interview that you're going to hear, we're going to be a lot more cavalier, unfortunately, with our use of the term addiction, and careful listeners will notice that addiction is sometimes used when we probably should use substance dependence if we were being more careful with our terminology. So just a bit of a caveat there. But a lot of really valuable and interesting information coming up. This is one that definitely can apply to everybody. Not everybody listening might take coluracetam or be interested in methylene blue or something like that, but all of us eat every day. Moreover, probably all of us know many people that have problems with their food intake, whether that's ourselves personally, family members, friends. It's no secret that there's a lot of unhealthy eating that goes on in society, probably more so now than in the past. We've got a great range of food options, and of course, as options proliferate, the number of good choices doesn't necessarily keep pace with the growth in choices overall. So a tricky time to be a food consumer right now, but hopefully this conversation will give some good guidance. So let's jump in now with Dr. Nicole Avena.
So I became interested in psychology when I was in college, and then I really became interested in doing research on the brain and how that can affect behavior. And I ended up going to graduate school at Princeton, and there I started getting more interested in how the brain can affect behavior in ways that might lead to unhealthy behaviors. That's when I started doing research on food intake and trying to understand some of the ways in which the brain might help us to understand why people find it very difficult to eat a healthy diet, especially in our modern food environment. And so it's kind of just sort of evolved over the years. The more work I do, the more I get interested in this, and the more diverse I think that my interests become, because there's just so many questions about health and about well-being. And I think a lot of it comes back to trying to understand what drives that behavior.
At the risk of pulling the wool back on your findings too early in the conversation, what have been some of the commonalities that you've found as far as the things that people have a hard time with and sort of some of the biological bases of those problems?
So one of the things that our lab is really focused on in terms of research is trying to understand how overeating highly palatable foods like junk foods and fast foods might be associated with addiction-like behaviors. So one of the things we've noted in the studies is that there are changes in the brain that occur when people overeat that are very similar to what you would see in someone who is using drugs of abuse. So we're finding lots of overlaps in terms of brain changes, but also in terms of these behaviors. And so compulsive feelings of wanting to binge on food and drug, feelings of wanting to engage in risky behaviors in order to get access to those things. We're seeing lots of commonalities that are occurring along the lines between eating these highly processed foods and what we typically see when we talk about drug addiction.
I just wonder, are the dopaminergic changes in the brain that makes things harder to say no to, does it distinguish between things like saying yes to a Snickers bar versus saying yes to a gambling versus saying yes to cheating on your spouse?
And I think that the brain is really complex, and it's sometimes hard to not want to boil everything down to what is dopamine doing in terms of how we can try to understand these things. But what does happen is that there is this commonality in terms of the way that the dopamine system is affected by all of those behaviors that you just mentioned. So one of the key things about drugs of abuse is that they repeatedly release dopamine every time they're administered. That's one of the hallmarks of drug use. That's why people find it so difficult to resist them once they're addicted, because you get this constant rush and this feeling of pleasure associated with that surge in dopamine release. But what happens with food typically, and other types of behaviors that are pleasurable but not necessarily addictive, is that the dopamine release tends to attenuate with repeated use. And so maybe the very first time you have a delicious cuisine, something maybe you've never tried before, you're going to release dopamine because dopamine's associated with the novelty of the food and just sort of paying attention to the food.
Right.
But once we know that it's safe and we're not going to get sick from it, one or two pairings will result in the attenuation of dopamine release. So you could still eat that food, but your brain's not going to necessarily release dopamine every time you do. But one of the things that's really interesting about highly palatable food and overeating is that we've found in our research that when you overeat a highly palatable food, a junk food, it produces that constant release in dopamine. That's more like what you'd see with a drug as opposed to just a regular food. And so that's one of the sort of, I think, key points that does help us understand this concept of food addiction, if you will, and that, we're seeing this pattern of dopamine release that is similar to what you'd see with drug addiction and not like what you'd expect to see just with everyday eating or regular food. And I think, again, a lot of it has to do with the sort of diet that that the person is accustomed to eating. And we see this in our studies because we run control groups in which, for instance, in our lab rats, they'll get access to a sugar snack or something that's palatable occasionally. And again, they can come to eat it in a way that doesn't release dopamine in this manner that looks like a drug. So it's not necessarily the food, but it's more of a combination of the food and the pattern in which it's administered. And so the animals that overeat the sugar and are constantly eating it and binging on it, those are the animals that are showing this perturbed effect on the dopamine system.
I've seen some interesting studies in addiction that show that addiction itself shows up more frequently, or addictive-like behaviors, when a person or a lab rat or whatever it is in a more deprived environment where there aren't a lot of other distractions or other enjoyable things that could be done. Is that something that you see with the food behaviors, that people who have more full or fulfilling lives are not quite as subject to these food addictions?
Yeah, that's a really good question. We haven't directly measured that, but I suspect that based on the animal literature, we would probably find something that would suggest what you're saying. So we know that when you have animals in an enriched environment, for instance, where they have lots of toys and other animals to interact with, they'll be more likely to be healthy in some sense. They aren't going to overeat. They're not going to want to take more of a drug compared to animals that are in isolation that pretty much lead a boring life. And I think that something can be said, pleasure derived from social interaction. And so as humans, we are gregarious animals, right? So we want to be with other humans and do other activities and participate in things. And I think that my experience clinically has been that when people are leading active and very involved lives, then they tend to have less of a problem when it comes to food. People who are leading lives that are maybe very stressful and have lots of sort of work turmoil, family turmoil, or in some sense lonely and don't have a lot of activities going on, those are the individuals that I find often tend to struggle a bit more with food. I don't think anyone's immune to the problem, but I do think by having these sort of other things in your life to fulfill not only your time, but also just to give you pleasure, I think that really can be helpful and can mitigate some of the sort of hedonic or pleasure eating that people tend to do.
There are certain things where it's pretty easy to determine whether something is an addictive behavior or not if it's something that the human body doesn't require. It's like nobody needs to have heroin, nobody needs to have nicotine. So these things are kind of, you can pretty easily classify whether it's an addiction or not. But something like food, a person can't go cold turkey and never eat food again. How does one distinguish between a food addict in that sense, or an addict for a type of food, versus everybody else, or somebody that has a passable relationship with their food?
Right. Yeah, that's one of the questions that I think about a lot, because I don't really like the term food addiction, but it's sort of the best thing we have. You're right. We need food to survive. We don't need cocaine to survive. But what we're finding is it isn't necessarily food that's addictive. It seems that it's certain types of food. So for instance, carrots and broccoli aren't the problem. It's cookies and crackers. That's one of the things that we're working on in my research lab right now, is trying to understand which foods are addictive, because you can't tell people, yeah, food's addictive. We need to classify which foods we're talking about.
Right.
So we published a study that's on my website. If anyone's interested, that you can get a link to the paper. And the website's www.drnicoleavena.com. The published paper came out last year in a journal, and we were able to identify which foods were most problematic in terms of addictive overeating in a clinical sample. And we were able to identify that the most addictive food turned out to be pizza. And when we went back and sort of did some more analyses on the different foods that we looked at, it turns out that the level of processing, or how highly processed a food is, was the strongest predictor of whether or not the food would be considered addictive. And so it seems that the more highly processed the food is, the more likely it is to be considered addictive. So I think when we start to talk about which foods are addictive, we are sort of looking more toward those highly processed man-made foods, if you will, not so much fruits and vegetables and these other types of staple foods that are part of a healthy diet.
When I think of the most highly processed foods, I think of something like Skittles that has no place in the natural environment, whereas I think that probably somebody could make a pizza with a reasonable number of ingredients if they knew what they were doing. I certainly couldn't. But for the perspective of somebody like me that doesn't have a huge knowledge around the kitchen, how does somebody determine how far along from the non-processed to highly processed spectrum a certain food is?
Right. Yeah. And that's part of the problem, because you're correct in that in our study, for instance, when we're talking about pizza as one of the examples, we were very clear with the participants to explain we're talking talking about a pizza that you would get at a pizza shop, like a Domino's pizza or something like that, as opposed to a gourmet pizza that you might make at home from dough, and you're adding the sauce and you're adding the cheese and things like that. So there is a big difference. When you talk about pizza, you can have a healthy pizza, I think, but you could also have a very unhealthy pizza that's obviously going to be the one that's got more highly processed ingredients. So these are good questions. And I think this is one of the things we need to figure out is, where do we draw the line, right? I mean, what is an acceptable amount of processing that might not lead to addictive like eating, and what is going to push someone over the edge? I think it might vary from person to person. Again, some people can handle eating Skittles and eating highly processed foods, and they can put the brakes on and stop when they're full, and it doesn't become a problem for them. But there are other individuals out there who seem to be more sensitive to these types of foods, in the sense that they do find it difficult to stop. They do find it difficult to feel satiated from them, and that can lead to eating more than intended and eating for the wrong reasons.
Are there commonalities with processed foods and things like macronutrient ratios between carbs, fats, and proteins? Are there other commonalities that you see jump out of your data as danger zones?
Yeah, so one of the things that stood out was the amount of fat. And so the foods that had more fat in them also seemed to be associated with addictive like eating. And we've done a lot of work in our lab looking at carbohydrates. And right now there's sort of this debate about whether or not carbohydrates are worse for you than fats, and which is sort of the opposite of what was going on about 10 years ago when everybody was saying that fats were bad for you.
Yeah, I grew up under the no fat regimen, and it seems like everything's flip-flopped in the past 10 years.
It certainly has. And so it's really an important question. And I personally think that it's all about moderation. I think the part of the problem with a lot of the processed foods, though, is that they contain fats and carbohydrates. And so my advice to people is not to try to just single out one nutrient and say, oh, I'm avoiding this at all costs. It's more about trying to identify the foods that are healthy foods that don't contain a lot of additives, don't contain a lot of these sort of added fats, added sugars. If they're going to have fat in it, it's going to be fat that's naturally there. So if you're going to have a hamburger, let's say, yeah, there's going to be fat in the meat because it's just naturally there from the animal. But I think that's really the key, is trying to help people understand what are the good sources of these things versus the bad sources. And I think that can really help with curtailing a lot of this type of eating.
How much do you think might be involved with things like packaging of food? Like if it's a kid's cereal, having a cute cartoon character on the box, or pizza. One of the things I think about with pizza, in addition to the fact it's probably not the most healthy food as far as the actual material constituents of it, people also like associate pizza with partying with their friends and stuff like that. And I feel like there's kind of a halo effect of the social associations on the actual food. Do you think other things like that play in?
Oh, for sure. I think that the packaging of foods is a very calculated and highly engineered process. And so a lot of thought and work goes into how the front of a package is going to look. A lot of thought and work and a lot of money actually goes into the placement of foods in the grocery store. And so It's not by accident that the junky fruit roll-ups and, the things with the pictures of the princesses on them and Scooby-Doo are at the eye level of your 3 or 4-year-old in the grocery store. That's done on purpose. And there's a lot that goes into sort of designing grocery stores to optimize the level and the placement of these products for the consumer. So that's something that I think we need to become aware of and know that when you go in a grocery store, the items that are on the end caps tend to be the things that are junk food, if you will. And so I think the packaging definitely plays a role in it. And like you mentioned, the social component of food, we associate grandma with apple pie. I mean, there's just this whole connection we have with food and people and activities. And so that association remains, and that is part of the reward that we get from that food, because when you eat that food, it activates parts of the brain that remember that. It serves as a trigger or secondary reinforcer that reminds us of those pleasant behaviors and pleasant experiences.
Unfortunately, we don't live in a culture that has a lot of broccoli feeds.
Right, exactly. So I think all this sort of plays into it, and it really just becomes a challenge to the everyday consumer of food to sort of navigate through this process where the foods are basically being engineered for us to eat them and to overeat them in many ways, not just by the taste and the smell, but also by the packaging and the placement and the advertising. So a challenge for people who find it difficult to control their intake of these certain foods.
What do you find is some of the strategies that can be effective for people if they realize they've got an unhealthy relationship with food? And that could be that they know that they're overweight, or there are probably other things too. I mean, obviously, there's plenty of eating disorders where a person might not wind up overweight, but what are some of the ways that a person can fix their food habits if they realize they've sort of gone astray?
Yeah, so I have a book that I wrote that came out about 2 years ago called Why Diets Fail. It's a great resource for this type of question. What I do in the book is sort of go through the research on food addiction and then sort of help people to figure out, if you do think you're addicted to food, well, what can you do about it? And like you're asking, what are some of the resources or ways in which you can sort of navigate through our food world? And so one of the big things that I think is important is to understand the nutrition label. And we're starting to see some changes being made on a government level to make those nutrition labels be a little bit more clear. But right now, that nutrition facts label that tells us how many calories a product contains, what are the ingredients, it can be difficult to understand. So one of the things that's important is to understand, when you do look at that label, what all the parts of it mean and how you can make sure that you're looking for products and eating products that are healthy. One of the things I tell people is to look at the ingredients. And if you see a sugar as one of the first 5 ingredients, then you should probably just decide to eat something else. It's also difficult because there's about 50 or 60 different names for sugar. And so when we go into a grocery store and look at a product and see, oh, this contains added high fructose corn syrup, that might be one of the many sugars that's in that product. So things like agave or things like sucrose or dextrose, those are all other names for sugar, other types of added sugars. And so it's important to recognize that. It's important to also recognize the fact that sometimes the names of these things can be tricky. So for instance, if you see something that has fruit concentrate in it, that's actually another form of sugar. Because when they talk about fruit concentrate, what that actually means is they concentrate all the sugar out of the fruit,
Right.
and then use that as the sweetener. So you're essentially throwing out the fiber and all the other nutrition that might be in an apple and just sucking out the sugar and using that as the sweetener. So things can be deceiving. It might sound healthy because it's got fruit in it, but there's really no fruit in it, just the sugar.
I was actually a fruitarian for a full year. This was probably about 10 years ago now. And, during that time, I ate a huge amount of dates because when you're on a diet like that, you wind up eating a lot of dates and bananas and things that are high sugar just to get enough calories to make it through your day. But dates, you look at the ingredient and it just says dates because that's the naturally occurring thing. But of course, like 99, probably 0.9% of the calories in a date is coming from fruit sugar. And so that there really are a lot of invisible sugars that could make it through the government's mandated ways of putting ingredients on things.
Yeah, and I think it just becomes, an educational issue. So we have to just get the word out to people so that people can learn the different names for sugars. So that's, I think, key is really understanding what is in the foods that we're eating and trying to make better food choices. That's not to say you can never have cookies again, but it's just trying to find a way in which you can moderate your intake. If you're a person who finds that it's difficult to stop at just 1 or 2 Chips Ahoy, then perhaps you need to take a break from Chips Ahoy and not eat them for a while. And in the book, I sort of walk people through the process of how do you basically detox from these types of foods? What are the steps you can take to cut them out of your diet so that you can regain control of your behavior? Your brain is malleable and it can change. Much like someone who goes off of a drug of abuse, you're going to experience perhaps withdrawal, cravings. And how do you cope with those things? It's something that a lot of people struggle with. And again, it's not to say that you never can have these cookies again, but it does, for many people, take a while until you can regain control of your behavior so that you're able to eat them in moderation and enjoy them, not eat them and then feel guilt because you ate too many of them.
I feel a lot of sympathy for people that are trying to bring food issues under control. Because if you're an alcoholic or a recovering alcoholic, it's pretty easy to just draw a line in the sand and say, I'm not going to enter a bar. I'm not going to walk down the liquor aisle at my grocery store. But you can't have an all or nothing relationship like that with food. And of course, the other people in your life aren't necessarily going to think, well, just because you had a problem with Oreos or Chips Ahoy or whatever doesn't mean I have a problem. And they're going to feel like they're probably more entitled to eat those sorts of foods in front of you than that you might like.
Yeah, there's a big social issue associated with this. And I often tell people one of the things that makes it a little bit easier for drug addicts is that there's no advertisements for drugs. You don't see billboards with heroin needles. You don't see, vending machines anymore with cigarettes. I mean, there's really no visual stimulation for drugs. And so if we had the amount of advertisements, heroin, as we do for food, then we'd probably have a much bigger drug problem on our hands in this country than we already do.
Yeah.
It's really difficult for people people who are trying to avoid these types of foods, to avoid them when they're constantly being thrown in our faces via advertisement. And like you said, even just innocent social interactions, people show up and bring food. You go to the office at someone's birthday, they're bringing in food, they're bringing in cupcakes, they're bringing in things that perhaps you have a problem with, but they don't. And so it does make it difficult from a social standpoint to sort of navigate through all this, because it isn't taboo. It is taboo to bring drugs to the office, so that's not a problem if you're having a drug problem, but it's not taboo to bring cupcakes or ice cream cake in because it happens to be somebody's birthday.
Is every overweight or obese person a food addict? And are there food addicts that are not overweight and obese? What is the crossover between those populations like?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so we've studied that there's been research that's been done on this. The answer is that every food addict is not overweight or obese, and every obese person is not necessarily a food addict. There are studies that suggest that people who are obese are more likely to be a food addict than someone who's lean. There's also studies that suggest that people who are obese and have comorbid binge eating disorder are more likely to be a food addict. So depending on the study, approximately 50% of people in that category meets the criteria for being a food addict. So it is something that is almost a symptom of many different types of disordered eating. We see in our studies of patients that have anorexia and bulimia evidence of food addiction. And these are people who are afraid of food, who don't want to eat it. So it's not necessarily the case that it's something that's linearly associated with someone's body weight. We're seeing it among populations of individuals that have normal body weight and also among populations of individuals who are overweight.
What would be going on with somebody who is obese, let's say carrying an extra 50 pounds, but doesn't have a food addiction?
Well, I mean, this is sort of where things stand medically now. If someone comes into their primary care physician's office and is 50 pounds overweight, they're just identified as being behaviorally overweight, right? I mean, they're eating too much and not getting enough to exercise, and it's sort of blamed on the person. And I don't know if I really agree with that approach, because yes, there is some level of personal responsibility associated with behavior, but based on what we're learning about these foods and how they affect the brain, I don't know if it's fair anymore to really fully blame the person if they have difficulty controlling their food intake. And just like with drugs of abuse, and I think alcohol is the best example to use, there can be people who abuse it but aren't addicted to it. And so plenty of people abuse alcohol and maybe drink too much one night or a few nights and have a binge drinking episode. They wouldn't necessarily meet the criteria of an alcoholic or feel the need to never have alcohol again, but they've abused it in some way. And I think people do that as well with food. And so the food addiction component, I think, is an important new dimension to thinking about obesity. I don't think it's the only dimension. I think we have other things we need to look at. Obviously, there's the genetic predisposition to be overweight. Since more and more Americans are overweight and obese, the genetics of that are going to lead to more and more children being born that are going to have that propensity to become overweight or obese.
The rise in obesity that we've seen in the past couple of years, I mean, that's not based on genetic change. I mean, it's happening too fast for it to be a genetic change. So I think we're seeing something that's more an adaptive behavior.
Right. No, I'm not saying that it's all associated with genetics, but we do have that genetic component that we can't ignore. Now, again, I agree that I think it's more of a behavioral effect that's occurring, but it's on the background now of individuals that are going to have that genetic propensity to carry extra weight. And I think that's something we need to consider over time. As time goes on, the longer this obesity problem is around, the stronger the genetic effect, I think, is going to be. And I think that's going to make it more and more difficult for us to rectify the problem.
If somebody does have an addictive personality type, what do you think draws them to one type of addiction versus another? Why does one person go for gambling, whereas another one goes for cheeseburgers?
I think that's a combination of social factors. So I like to think of it as if you grow up in a family of alcoholics, you might have that genetic propensity to yourself become an alcoholic. But because you grew up in an environment where you saw the devastation that could occur because of alcohol, you choose to avoid alcohol at all costs. But in some way, you might turn to something else. And so for those individuals, it might be food. And we actually do see quite a bit of that. People who have a history of family alcoholism have a greater likelihood of preferring sweet foods and having problems with their weight. And so I think that could explain some of it. And, I think a lot of it just boils down to life experiences and circumstances and what takes you in one direction versus another.
Since sugars are sort of the primary thing that you're watching for, I'm thinking if you lived in like Papua Papua New Guinea or something like that, where your native food might have been a bunch of starchy tubers and fresh bananas year round, things like that would have been a natural paleo style diet, but also one that's very high in sugars. Is there a problem, you think, with a diet like that, or the fact that it's not processed or largely unprocessed kind of gives people a free pass?
In terms of the research, I really think that the processing is starting to stand out as one of the features that we need to be looking at. And again, because these types of foods that might be high in sugar naturally also are high in fiber usually and other nutrients that can mitigate the effects that the sugar can have on the brain.
And water volume too is not to be underestimated.
Right, exactly. That's true. And so if you look at the sugar content in a Snickers bar versus an apple, for instance, there might not be much difference in the sugar content, but we do see that the ingredients are very different. So there's lots of fiber in the apple and other nutrients that can mitigate the effects of that sugar.
If I took a bunch of the same macronutrients, the same amount of dietary fiber, the same amount of water that's carried along with the food source and put it in a blender and rearranged it a bunch, technically I would be processing it, but it seems like it would be the same thing once it got to my stomach.
Again, I don't like the term food addiction because I feel like it's too general. I also don't like the term processing because it's too general because let's face it, you process a steak the minute you slaughter the animal, right? I mean, that's the beginning of the processing point. I think that we really do need to come up with a unified definition of what is highly processed versus less processed. And I think that it's going to take some time for us to kind of come together and define that better. But you raise a really good point. I tend to look at the level of processing as the number of ingredients. And we actually went through this when we were doing our research on this with respect to food addiction in the sense of how do we define a highly processed food? And for us, we did it based on the number of ingredients. And so when I give my lectures, I give a kind of a cool example. I'll try to explain it. But if you look at the nutrition facts label for baby carrots, you'll see that they contain one ingredient, and that's baby carrots. And if you look at the nutrition facts label for mini Pop-Tarts, you'll see that they contain 50 different ingredients, half of which I've never heard of, and chemicals and colors and additives and things like that. And so somewhere in the middle of that is a line that we can hopefully draw that would be, probably a pretty thick line that would help us to differentiate between what would be the one extreme, which would be a highly processed food like a mini Pop-Tart versus something that is a very lowly processed food like a bag of baby carrots.
Is it reasonable to think that, regardless of where you came from in the world, as far as your family history, the amount of ingredients that you would have had in your diet 200 years ago versus what we all have access to in any given grocery store now is just 100 times more nowadays? Do you think that to a certain extent, we're confusing our guts, throwing so many different ingredients at them that we can't hone in on how to internally process the wide range of foods that we're giving ourselves versus if you lived in Madagascar 200 years ago, you maybe had 15 staple foods that you ate and your gut got really good at those 15. And if you ate something from a different part of the world, maybe you wouldn't have known how to handle it as well.
I think that's a great hypothesis. It'd be wonderful to study that more and test it. And if you think about many of the, again, that term highly processed foods, but many of them contain ingredients that are all man-made. So they're not necessarily something that biologically we would recognize. So yeah, I think that could be a part of the problem. And it's definitely something I think to think about. And the sheer number of ingredients and the sheer different variety that we have now, I think can play a role. And one of the things that we've learned from the dieting literature, the dieting research, is that variety can really hurt you. And so if you want to lose weight, the best thing to do is to eat the same thing every single day, because studies have shown, and there's been lots of work on this, that the more variety you have in your diet, the more likely you are to overeat. That's why when people go to a buffet, for instance, they always eat more because you get what they call sensory specific satiety. So, I can't have another bite of pasta, but look, there's some Chinese food. I could really go for a little taste of that. And once you're done with that, look, there's dessert. So when you have these different taste and different cuisines available, it can lead you to then suddenly develop an appetite for them, even though you might be satiated and not necessarily need all the extra calories.
Yeah, that's a great point. When I think about addictions, I think that probably a lot of it is not just a physiological response, but also deal with a learned behavior, kind of burning certain neural pathways that you go back to again and again and again. You get caught in a rut. At some points in a person's life, you're more prone to certain types of learning. Young children are famously at a crucial age for learning language. Is there an age at which, or other circumstances at which, a person might be particularly susceptible to picking up a bad food habit?
Yeah, I think that what we're finding from the research is unfortunately the case that it might actually happen before we're even born.
Wow.
And so we've done some studies in my lab looking at the effects of overeating during pregnancy. And I can speak from experience because I've multiple children, and I can say that there's a lot that goes into eating when you're pregnant, and you try your best to eat healthy, but it's not always easy. And it is a time when women feel that they can indulge and they're not so concerned about their body weight. So there are periods of unhealthy eating that occur during pregnancies for sure. And what the research is finding, though, is that what we eat when we're pregnant can have long-term effects on the baby, not only in terms of food preferences, but also in terms of body weight and in terms of the development of the brain. And there's been some really interesting studies done in animals that show that if you have rats that are pregnant and give them a really rich diet full of junk food, the babies actually grow up to prefer highly palatable junk foods. They have changes in the brain that are associated with alterations in those dopamine genes that look more like what you'd see with a drug addict than with someone who's just eating food. And there's also the case that they have a preference or are more likely to use drugs later on in life. And so we're finding that there's definitely a strong impact on what the mother has when she's pregnant in terms of the outcomes of the baby. So I think that we need to approach this as sort of a lifelong problem, in the sense that at any age we're at risk for development of these bad habits. And habits can be broken, but it's just that the longer that they're trained, the harder it is to break them. In terms of targeting, I think it's just a matter of educating people at all phases of life. And so providing better education for women during pregnancy, I think, is a key thing, because there's really not a lot of nutrition advice out there for women when they're pregnant. They're told to try to eat healthy and not gain too much weight, but they're not told what foods they should eat or why they should eat them. They're also not really given much support in terms of controlling their appetite on the background of these cravings and different, hormone fluctuations. So I actually wrote a book that came out last year on that topic. It's called What to Eat When You're Pregnant. And I was inspired to write it when I was pregnant with my older daughter, because I'm a doctor and I felt like I should know what I'm doing when it comes to eating, especially because I research this for a living. And I was just at a loss. I knew I should try to eat healthy, but there really wasn't any advice about what foods are important to eat during which part of the pregnancy, and how do you cope with these cravings, and how do you deal with these issues related to trying to maintain a healthy body weight. So I think it's a good resource for women who are thinking about having a baby or who are themselves pregnant, in terms of understanding what foods are going to be optimal to eat to make sure that the baby gets off on the right foot and you also keep your health and your weight in check.
There's that really interesting study that I think has been cited a whole bunch and a lot of people are familiar with, about the Dutch hunger winter. But the quick version of it is that I think it was 1944, the winter of 44 in World War II, where people in the Netherlands just were living on 900 calories per day for an adult for months and months and months. And so the people that were in utero at that point, when they grew up, they were much more likely to become overweight or obese, because their body was taught from what they were exposed to as far as this total lack of calories while they were in utero, that they were going to be born into a caloric deficient environment and to hold on to every calorie for dear life. Do we see the opposite of that at all with people who their mother is overeating and is overweight while they are in utero? That maybe they're kind of like, you know what, we got more calories than we know what to do with, let's burn calories fast.
I'm glad you brought that up, because that's actually what inspired our research on trying to understand what are the effects of these types of overeating during pregnancy. And that would be what you would expect, right? Based on that research, you might expect to see the opposite if someone's overeating. I think what we found, though, and this has been shown in subsequent studies that were done in response to that Dutch winter famine research, is that if leptin levels were found to be perturbed during the development of the brain of the fetus. Mm-hmm. And that was one of the things that was associated with storing excess body weight and having sort of a more voracious appetite as the person grew up and became an adult. And so there were sort of this biological change that occurred that could help us to identify why the person might be more likely to gain weight. But I think we have more of what we would consider to be what statistically you talk about as being an inverted U. And so it's not necessarily the opposite, but the same thing that happens. And so if someone overeats during pregnancy, the studies are suggesting that it can also alter areas of the brain that sort of occurring in different regions. And so we're finding that it's in areas of the brain that are associated with pleasure and reward. And so it's affecting the dopamine system and brain opioid systems in ways that are sort of programming the babies to then grow up and prefer these types of foods.
Right.
Much like what you see with babies who are born addicted to drugs. Like, fortunately, we don't see it all that much, but there still are crack babies that are born addicted to crack. And it's something that sort of sets them up to begin life preferring this, or having a need or a dependency, if you will, on this particular type of food. And in the case of drugs, on a particular drug. And so I think that whether or not one overeats or undereats, it can still result in the same body weight perturbation during pregnancy in the offspring. And that's kind of where we get that inverted U. It's not necessarily sort of a linear relationship.
Do you see any correlations between food addiction and just anything else interesting, sort of like an out of left field correlation that you might not have expected?
Well, the one thing I can say is that the food addiction literature, one of the things that kind of stood out to me was that there was a correlation between food addiction and compulsive behavior.
That makes sense.
Yeah, it makes sense, but it kind of stood out to me as another way of thinking about the addiction and the fact that it's not just about the food, but it might also be about the behavior. And I think it sort of underscores this whole component of, much like with drugs of abuse. I mean, if you talk to people who are addicted to drugs, they don't actually really like the drug. It's more the whole process of acquiring the drug. And there's a lot of reinforcement that goes into the whole repertoire. I think about this with people who smoke cigarettes. And so they feel pleasure out of just the act of lighting the cigarette and then inhaling. And so it's not necessarily the addictive agent that is the thing that drives them to get the pleasure. There's all these other reinforcers that have become associated with it through repeated use and habitual use. And I wonder if that type of behavior is what we see with some cases of food addiction, where it's the rustling of the bag of potato chips and the sound that it makes and the smell when you open up a bag of cookies, or these other things that go into the ritual really can be very powerful and contribute to these types of behaviors.
It seems like there's a major blind spot in our language, or maybe just our intuitions, as far as the difference between wanting and liking. We kind of think of wanting and liking as always being a package deal, but it's very possible to want something and not like it. And I think the point that you just made about cigarettes is a great one. My grandfather was a severe cigarette addict, but he didn't really like them that much. It's just that when he didn't have them, he wanted them really badly. And it was interesting to hear him describe the dichotomy between those two emotions.
Yeah, and there's been a lot of research that's gone on over the past couple of years to dissociate the effects, or just to dissociate the effects in the brain on wanting something versus liking something. And it does seem to be that there's different neurotransmitter systems that are activated with respect to those two different things. And so I think it's really fascinating to dissect all this and think about the different components of these behaviors. And it isn't black and white. It's not just people eat these foods because they taste good and people use drugs because the drugs make them feel good. There's a very complex and very complicated process that occurs here, both in the brain and behaviorally, that we're really just starting to learn about and to try to figure out.
I actually, a couple of weeks ago, did an interview with a guy who's one of the world's lead researchers on nicotine. He made the point that nicotine is, bar none, the most addictive single substance known. That something like 85% of people, if exposed to enough nicotine, will become nicotine addicts. Whereas heroin, which everybody thinks of as being like the addictive substance to end all addictive substances, the actual percentage of the population that would get addicted to heroin if given a bunch of heroin is only about 50%. And caffeine is only like 15 to 20%. And most things are way less physiologically addictive than our intuitions or conventional wisdom would lead us to expect. Where do you feel food or the wrong types of food fall on that spectrum? Like, what is our addictive capacity?
Well, that's a really good question. And people will often ask me, just sort of, is, for instance, cocaine more addictive than food? Or, which drug is the most addictive drug? A couple of thoughts here. So one, I think that these highly processed foods fall close to the realm of nicotine addiction in terms of the social component. Because if you think about it, although over the past 10 or 15 years, we've seen a lot of changes with respect to smoking in terms of how society views it. There's a lot more rules about it. You can't smoke in public places anymore. You can't buy cigarettes as easily as you used to be able to, but it's still legal, and you can still buy cigarettes and you can still give them to your friends and you can still smoke in your home and do whatever you want. There's no laws against it, but it's still the leading cause of preventable death death in the United States. And other professor you were speaking about is correct in the sense that society tends to think of a drug addict as quintessential heroin addict, which is somebody who maybe lost their job and is having problems with the law. But those are relatively rare compared to the fact that the biggest addict out there is someone who smokes. And so I think on a social level, food falls close to nicotine in the sense that food is available, it's easy to get, it's legal. It's actually even easier than nicotine because there's no laws about advertising, there's no laws about giving it to kids. So we have even more free reign to acquire it. But I think we have to remember, though, that it does come down to individuals and individual differences. And so, for instance, I could occasionally have a cigarette perhaps and never get addicted, but somebody else might be highly addicted to cigarettes if they just have them a couple of times. And then there's some individuals out there who could use these harder drugs like cocaine or heroin and are more likely to get addicted to them. So I think we have to consider this individual differences and also the genetic component and the predisposition, like we talked about earlier, that there could be some people out there who are just predisposed to become addicted to anything. And whatever drug, or if it's maybe even a food, if not a drug, happens to come their way or happens to its way into their life, that could be the problematic substance for them.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So thank you so very much to Dr. Nicole Avena for taking the time for that conversation. I feel like I probably know more than your average man on the street about diets and nutrition and all that stuff. It's certainly something that I take some time to study, but there was still a bunch of stuff in that conversation that I had not been privy to. One concept was sensory-specific satiation, the idea that it's easier to overeat when you have a lot of choices right in front of you. That's one that it's a forehead slapper in retrospect, but it's not something that a lot of us think about, and I think could be really useful for somebody to keep in mind if they are trying to lose weight or just maintain their weight. The general heuristic that more processed food is more addictive, also really interesting to keep in mind, although, as she said, processing is sort of a gray and nebulous term. Tough to know exactly what counts as processing, but a good proxy for that is probably the number of ingredients. And one last little fun component, I don't know if this is fun, but thinking about food as a source of addiction, one of the hallmarks of the term addiction, what it actually means is that a person is willing to engage in risky behaviors to acquire whatever it is that they're craving. You can kind of envision how this might apply to what we think of traditionally as addiction. If somebody is addicted to methamphetamines, they might be holding up their local liquor store. The holding up the liquor store would count as a risky behavior. Because food and even unhealthy foods are so pervasively available to most people, it's a little tougher to see what the risky behaviors that one might participate in to get access to junk food are. But luckily, we don't have people holding up Dunkin' Donut shops for the donuts themselves. Things like that are not a part of society, and probably because there's no prohibition on donuts. Again, going back to that Maya Solovitz episode, criminalizing things that people crave has all sorts of follow-on disaster consequences that go well beyond the damage that the cravings, the substance dependencies, and even the addictions might do themselves. But before I get on my political soapbox, I'm just going to cut myself off. Hope that this was useful and that everybody has both a very tasty holiday time and a healthy new year. Balance those as you see fit, and let's move on to the ruthless listener retention gimmick.
Smart Drug Smarts, ruthless listener retention gimmick.
So keeping it slightly on theme with talk about addiction or substance dependence, the particular study that we're about to talk about here deals with nicotine, but you can imagine or at least speculate how this might apply to everything from Cheetos to black tar heroin to anything in between. An interesting study done by researchers at Virginia Tech and the University of Texas at Dallas, looking at addicted smokers, people between the ages of 30 and 50 who have serious cigarette habits. They put these folks in a 2x2 matrix with a couple of conditions, either of which could be true. First of all, they asked these people to stop smoking on the previous night, sleep through the night, get up in the morning, not smoke for a while, then come in to be tested upon. So these are addicted cigarette smokers, very ready for their day's first cigarette, and they haven't had it yet. And they had each of these people come in, and during the course of this experiment, they would get each of 4 different experiences possible in this 2x2 matrix of either getting a real cigarette that actually had nicotine in it versus a placebo cigarette that did not contain nicotine, and then whether they were told that the cigarette contained nicotine or whether they were told that the cigarette did not contain nicotine. So in some cases, they were told, hey, this is a placebo. And half of the time when they were told it was a placebo, it actually wasn't a placebo. It actually did have nicotine. So you can kind of imagine a little tic-tac-toe board of 4 cases. Then they were looking at the effects both perceptually, how it felt to the people, whether their craving was diminished once they smoked the cigarette, what actually went on in their brains based on looking at fMRI scans, and finally how they performed after their cigarette, whether it's a real or a fake cigarette, working on a computer-based decision-making game. And the really fascinating finding finding here was that it was only when the people were told that they had a cigarette containing nicotine that you really saw the responses that would be associated with their craving being satisfied, not being stressed out like I need that cigarette kind of feeling, and even calming down enough to have a slightly better performance on the decision-making game. So you would certainly expect that the person who's getting a real cigarette and is told, yes, this is a real cigarette, after they've been jonesing for a cigarette for the last however many hours, that their craving would go down, their performance would improve, and that is definitely what all the measurements showed in that case. What was less intuitive and certainly a surprise to the researchers was that people that received real nicotine but were told that they were getting a placebo really didn't get many of the benefits that would typically have been associated with the nicotine. And conversely, people that got the placebo but were told that they were actually getting nicotine did get some of the benefits. Said Reed Montague, a co-author of the study, "We expected the presence of nicotine to show some sort of craving response compared to conditions where the subjects did not receive nicotine, despite the belief about the nicotine given, but that was not what we found." Co-author Jeosi Gu added, "These results suggest that for drugs to have an effect on a person, he or she needs to believe that the drug is present." And these findings coming from the questionnaires given to the participants where they rated their craving levels before and after smoking the cigarette and performing the task, lined up with what the fMRI data showed. The scans showed a significant neural activation that correlated with both craving and the learning signals when participants smoked a nicotine cigarette that they believed contained nicotine. But smoking that same nicotine cigarette and being told that it was merely a placebo did not produce the same brain signals. The fMRI data was specifically looking at the insula cortex, a brain region that deals, among other things, with body perception and self-awareness. So if you're feeling cravings, your insula cortex is where that feeling is coming from within the brain. This is one of those frustrating findings that you kind of wish wasn't true, because it's awful to think all the medical discoveries that might be missed if the patient's belief in something working is sort of a necessary component to actually make it work within the body. Just a silly example, but imagine a coma patient who's not aware of their surroundings. Regardless of the efficacy of the drug that you give them, getting buy-in from a coma patient isn't going to be possible. I don't think it's something that Western medicine likes to give a lot of thought to, that a person's opinion of a drug that they're given should have all that much bearing of whether the drug does something. But an interesting and provocative finding. We do have an upcoming episode on placebo. We've already done one episode on placebo, but placebo effects and nocebo effects, sort of the dark twin of placebo, are so interesting and weird and powerful that it deserves a second conversation, and that'll be an episode coming up early in 2017. So stay tuned for that. Just a little bit of a sneak preview here, something to get you thinking.
We like to think of ourselves as a digital speakeasy for brain hackers, but you can call us Smart Drug Smarts.
Okay, so you heard it. That is all for episode number 160, our second to last episode of 2016. Everything that we talked about here will be online at smartdrugsmarts.com/160. And if you missed last week's episode, in 159, we were talking about music and the brain, good things music might be able to do for our brains, and why our brains are wired up to enjoy music as much as they do. Next week, we're going to be talking about how the brain repairs itself from damage, and a chemical that we're starting to learn more about that is apparently vital to that process. That'll be our Ringing Out of 2016 episode, coming at you just before the crack of the new year. A very happy holidays to everybody, whether you are in the frozen reaches of northern Canada or the sunny climes of southern Australia. Hope that all is well with you and yours, and see you next week. Same time, same podcast, and with the same unflagging commitment to helping you fine-tune the performance of your own brain. Have a great holiday week and hopefully a vacation. And stay smart.
You've been listening to the Smart Drug Smarts podcast. Visit us online at www.smartdrugsmarts.com and subscribe to our mailing list to keep your neurons buzzing with the latest in brain optimization. Smart Drug Smarts should be listened to for entertainment purposes only, although some guests on the show are medical doctors, most are not, and the host is just some random guy. Nothing you hear on this podcast or read at smartdrugsmarts.com should be considered medical advice. Consult your doctor and use some damn common sense before doing anything you think might have a lasting impact on your brain.